wizard guy. Hit a couple of clubs, talk to some strangers, and after this we'll go down to the docks and see about that boat thing. What kind of beat?
Actually, me too.
Evening, everyone.
Hi, Mel.
Hiya.
How you doing? I'm not coughing, honestly.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, councillors. Good evening to the members of the public who are listening online. I'm Councillor Mark Corey, and this is the Council's scrutiny panel. We are here on the 14th of September 2021, and this is the Crime and Disorder panel, part of the scrutiny panel. So welcome everybody, and thank you, Owen, for indicating that we are now live and recording. I just have to do the housekeeping that in event of an emergency, there are no planned evacuations for this evening. So if an alarm does sound, please evacuate the town hall by going down the main staircase or the back staircase to the high street, whichever is appropriate, and then to the car park behind the town hall in St Ranelagh Street. This meeting is being broadcast live over the internet on the council's YouTube channel and will be available to watch afterwards. Please would speakers use the microphones at all times and speak directly into the microphone as the live audio is taken from the microphone feed. Toilets are available on this floor as well as the ground floor and first floor. Discreet use of mobile phones and other devices is welcomed, but you are requested to switch them to silent and to not use voice or camera flash functions. We may break at 7:30, subject to the expected length of discussions, and we will judge that on our own terms. I've introduced myself. I'm Councillor Mark Corey, representative of Wivenhoe Ward, and I chair these meetings of the Scrutiny and the Crime and Disorder panel. I'm going to invite other councillors and officers to introduce themselves now. To my right.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. My name is Councillor Tina Bourne at Greensted Ward.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Councillor Lorcan Whitehead, Newtown and Christchurch Ward.
Good evening, Lynn Barton, Shrub End Ward.
Thank you, Chair. Pam Donnelly. I'm the chair of the Safer Colchester Partnership.
Good evening, Chief Inspector Rob Huddleston, District Commander.
Good evening, it's Daryl Upton from Tiptree Ward.
Councillor Barbara Wood, Tiptree Ward.
Dennis Willets, Lexton and Breeswick Ward.
Good evening, Nigel Chapman, Rural North Ward.
Owen Howell, Clerk of Committee, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you all, and it's nice to have a full team tonight, no substitutions, and we welcome Pam Donnelly as the visiting chair of One Colchester, but also one of our Colchester Borough Council officers, and welcome to Inspector Huddleston, our commander for the area. So we have no urgent items recorded. Declarations of interest, are there any for this evening's meeting? Okay, no indications. We can move on. The minutes of the last meeting, the meeting of the 16th of February 2021 and the meeting on the 26th of May, which was just to appoint the committee. Can I ask for approval of those two sets of minutes, please? Thank you. I'll move on. Item 6, have your say. We have no members of the public come this evening, and I've been informed we have no members visiting via digital link. So unless anyone's come along, Owen, no, we have no have your say speakers. Thank you. So we move to the main item this evening, which our guests are here to introduce. So the Safer Colchester Partnership, understanding the role of that partnership and how it keeps our residents safe. And I hand over to Pam Donnelly first, and from there we can introduce others. So thank you. Over to you, Pam.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank you and the committee for giving us the opportunity to bring the work of the Safer Colchester Partnership to you this evening. I'm going to avoid a long list of thank yous, but I think it would be remiss of me not to thank the many partners, I'm just looking at the attendance list, who've come along this evening to support us. Those partners have been absolutely critical, always are, to the work of the partnership, but certainly over the last year have been absolutely critical, and I'd like to thank them as chair for their support. I'd also like to thank the community safety team in Colchester Borough Council, and I know they can't all be with us here this evening, but in particular Mel Rundle, Sonia Carr and Lisa Hobson, for whom we have a a great deal of debt to thank in relation to the report that you have in front of you. There's a great deal of work going into this report, which I hope you've had the chance to read. We've also, in recent days, circulated an additional Appendix A. And the reason for that is that we wanted members to have as an up-to-date position as possible on some of the outcomes from the work and investment that goes into the Safer Colchester Partnership. So my intention this evening really is to do a couple of things. First of all, simply to highlight some of the key points, because clearly there's been an opportunity to read the report before. Secondly, I will, when I've finished picking up those key highlights, introduce you to Rob Huddleston, our Borough Commander, Chief Inspector. And before I go any further, I just want to thank him in particular and his team for the fantastic partnership working that we see. It's a real exemplar here in Colchester, and these relationships are not easy to sustain when times get tough. And as we are, we hope, coming out of the pandemic, the challenges are still there. And only over the weekend, Rob took the time to make sure that we were all aware of some of the issues that were going on in the town centre. And that becomes a focus of our attention over the coming months. But I don't think all partnerships are as good as this one. And they're only good because of the people that put the effort and contribution into making them so. So I think that's my thank yous over. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. In relation to the report, it's clearly set out, thanks to Sonia. So I just wanted to pick up a couple of things. I think everyone by now is familiar with the work of the partnership. What perhaps you're less familiar with, and I think the new arrangements are reflected in some of the partners that have joined us this evening, is that we now operate under the auspices of One Colchester, which for me is a really important step because it allows us to make the important links between economic prosperity, health and well-being, and community safety. And to pretend that there isn't a relationship there, I think, is ignoring the reality. So although the Community Safety Partnership is a statutory partner, or a statutory organisation, I should say, we fulfil, I can absolutely assure you, all our statutory duties. However, we now do that in the context of a wider strategic partnership, which I think gives a better outcome for Colchester. The report just gives you a summary of some of the work that we've done and highlights the priorities. Also gives you a little bit of a flavour about what our plans are for the future, but I think I have to be cautious here because the watchword is flexibility. There's one thing that this partnership has had to be over the last year or so, and that's dynamic and flexible and reflecting the fact that every day brings a different challenge. So I think that's important when setting out plans. The work I'd particularly like to refer to, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through it all in detail, is the annual partnership plan, which has been updated. I mentioned that a few moments ago, because that really gives you a sense of, well, that's all very well to have good partnerships, but what are the real outcomes? And I think what that plan does is to highlight the priorities, priority 1, 2, and 3, all agreed in partnership with our police colleagues and other partners, and then goes into detail, almost line by line, as to what that means in practice, what benefits have emerged. And I guess I'm reluctant to pick out any particular one because they're all important, but I do know that Rob is going to talk in a few moments about one or two of them. So at that point, I'd like to stop. I'm sure you'd like me to too, because that means there's more time for questions. In the past, I think we've done lengthy presentations, and I think that's restricted your ability to ask questions. So overview tonight, hand over to Rob for his report, and then open to you for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of the current position of Colchester in terms of crime and antisocial behaviour, and then talk briefly through the 3 key priorities in our partnership plan. You'll all be aware of the figures that went into that report for July, and I'm really pleased to say that we've continued our basis of crime reduction. with overall crime now 5.8% below what we were at the same time last year. So we're still much lower than 2020. In particular, the key areas for me are violence with injury being a huge reduction, almost double that compared to other areas in Essex Police. Robbery down over 20%, residential burglary down 37.7%, and business and community burglary down 26.1%. These are all real key indicators that the prevention plans we've put in place as a partnership are starting to have some effect. And what we've seen is those previous crimes where people lacked confidence to report, we've seen more people coming forward. So we've seen an increase in stalking and harassment offences being reported. And we've also seen an increase across some of our hate crimes, but I'll talk to you a little bit more around our hate crime areas when we get to our vulnerability piece. But really key for me is a really interesting statistic that we currently have 87.2 crimes per 1,000 people in Colchester, which I think is quite impressive. When I look across all the towns and districts in Essex, of the 12 districts, it puts us 6th. And bearing in mind, we're one of the biggest towns and districts in the county. I'm really quite proud of that fact. So talking about priority 1, tackling organised crime, gangs and county lines with an emphasis on drug trafficking. It's been a real key focus for Essex Police. We know that drug trafficking is at the core business, but what follows from that is exploitation of vulnerable young people, exploitation of vulnerable people with addictions, and some really serious violence. So we've invested in a serious violence unit across the county and a violence and vulnerability unit to join up the work we were previously doing locally with our gangs teams. Since March, our North Raptor team have made over 60 arrests, charged and remanded 28 drug dealers, seized over £12,000 of drugs and seized 18 of the main line phones. An interesting statistic I got yesterday was that from identification of a drug line phone through to removal of that phone now is down to around 3 weeks for us to totally attribute the phone, understand the complete organisational structure of that county line, and then take it out from top to bottom. And we've developed some really close partnership working with colleagues in the Metropolitan Police. In some cases, I think the furthest afield we've been is Croydon to execute warrants that were bringing drugs into Colchester. Currently across the north of Essex, we're focusing on 16 particular county lines, some of which touch Colchester. And again, for 10 of those, we're in joint development with the Metropolitan Police. Our community policing team, as well as engagement, are also focusing on some of our more local dealers and cannabis in particular. And only in the last week or so, 2 warrants have resulted in arrests, and a further warrant today has resulted in arrests for Class A drugs and cannabis. But a big focus for us is around protecting the vulnerable. So we've introduced safeguarding officers to our Raptor teams, and we're really proud of our joint working with a charity called Justice and Care, who are providing a victim navigator for children exploited by drug gangs. And in order to address addiction issues, we're very aware that we leave vacuums when we take out county lines. So we're using the same county lines marketing model that they do, and that we're texting end users of those county lines once we take out a county line, signposting them to charities such as Open Road, where they can get help for their addiction. And what this has meant as we've taken out county lines is a reduction in overall violence. And you'll be aware that at previous meetings I've sat and talked about the really high level of stop search we had in Colchester, where at one stage, 1 in every 3 stop search was resulting in a knife being located. Well, I'm really pleased to see that we've been able to reduce the number of instances of stop search, and that's been a deliberate decision. All of our stop search is intelligence-led. And this was about ensuring that we are now far more targeted and specific, as we didn't need to use the tactic in such a widespread manner. But while we're talking about stop search, we're really, really mindful of that disparity in stop search across the county. At my current stop search figures, 8% of all those stop searched are from Black or Black British backgrounds. According to our 2011 census, 8% of our population were non-white. So I'm really mindful that we scrutinise that and make sure that when we're delivering stop search, we do it ethically and we do it based on intelligence. As such, we have our own internal scrutiny panels, and the Force has just opened up a scrutiny panel to members of the public who are linked through our independent advisory groups to come in, look at the intelligence behind those stop searches, watch the body-worn video of officers undertaking that stop search, and ensure that's a positive experience for those being searched. Moving on to driving down antisocial behaviour and violent crime, especially hate crime. In terms of ASB, we have seen a 22.4% increase over previous years, but I just want to give some reassurance around that. All the tickets we gave out for COVID count as antisocial behaviour, so there's going to be a spike. We are completely engaged again as a community policing team. Op Luscombe has restarted, for those of you unaware of that. That's the multi-agency hub where our street drinkers and street homeless can meet all the agencies in one go. But it's not just a case of inviting somebody to turn up. It's carrot and stick. We invite you to turn up. If you continue begging and causing a nuisance, we tell you to turn up. And if you still fail to engage, we prosecute you. That's seen a great reduction in our town centre begging and the aggressive nature of that particular problem. We continue to work really closely with Colchester Borough Council and Colchester Borough Homes to enforce community protection notices and community protection warnings that have been issued around those tenants that cause problems or those particular problem individuals. Our joint patrols across the town and our dedicated town team work until 4 o'clock in the morning to ensure our nighttime economy has a visible presence through the main opening hours. There's no other CPT that works till that time in the morning. The latest anywhere else in the county works is 2 AM. We work really closely with our Royal Military Police colleagues and we welcomed a new major to the RMP recently. To give you an example of some of the work we've done, a male recently convicted a court of 13 counts of criminal damage across the town centre and into our rural locations. Not only did he get 200 hours community service, but he's now subject to a 2-year criminal behaviour order. What that means is if we see him out in town, we're going to ask what's in his bag, and if he's got so much as a marker pen, he's back in front of the courts. So to talk through our hate crimes a little bit, Essex Police have become one of the first forces to adopt gender-based hate crime, and we're seeing that come through already. And that's a real reflection of the work the partnership has done and the work of the hate crime engagement officers and those volunteers who staff our hate incident reporting centres and volunteer to become hate crime ambassadors across the district. We've seen a massive increase in confidence for people to come forward and report their concerns. And that can only be a positive thing. We're going to continue that engagement work. We're looking at new ways to engage and we're increasing some of the work we're doing in schools so that we can start engaging with pupils around hate crime in our younger generations. Our final priority, identifying and supporting the reporting of hidden harms with a proactive approach to those at risk of domestic abuse and sexual offences. We continue to work in partnership with the Southend Essex Thorough Domestic Abuse Board to ensure we provide that wider support to vulnerable victims. In Colchester, we've not only invested heavily in the domestic abuse investigation team, but also a domestic abuse problem solving team who now work with those vulnerable victims who are repeat victims. And we work with those people who are repeat offenders, looking at diversion behaviour programmes and looking to empower the victims to have the confidence to make some difficult choices. DA is a real priority for Essex Police and we're working to ensure we respond as effectively as possible. Our core focus within my response teams at the moment is around DA today. If we get a DA call, we're going to be with that victim today and make sure we're looking after them and minimising the risk to them. It's been proven that the faster the response, the more likely the victim is to engage and work with the police and get a longer term positive outcome. So a big focus. Our CPT are working with partners such as Next Chapter to provide drop-in coffee mornings, and we're working with the university and schools providing engagement on safe relationships, consent and the dangers of impairment. That's a real whirlwind tour. I also just wanted to touch upon the big subject, which was the emergence from COVID. We've seen a big increase in those visiting our town centre to enjoy our nighttime economy. I think on the second weekend, somebody told me there were 15,000 people in town. What we have seen is some specific instances of violence, but when I take that as a picture against the overall number of people in town, that remains really low, and I think that's a real positive. The lead out of COVID has also seen us being able to get back to some of that really good community policing engagement work that is the real core of us developing those community relationships. And so we've been trying some different things across the summer to engage with some different young people. We ran some basketball sessions. 78 young people attended that across the summer holiday. Really pleased to report that 52% of those attendees were from communities that we don't normally engage with at a youth level, from our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and our Eastern European community. So we plan to expand that programme. We've been working really closely with Tiptree Parish Council, the Youth Service and Tiptree Youth Service and the Thirstable School around youth provision in Tiptree and how we deal with some of the issues from the local youth there. Colchester United again have partnered and come up with PL kick sessions, free football sessions for our young people, but actually dependent on the young person attending some of their sessions to discuss hate crime, extremism, antisocial behaviour, county lines, etc. And by partaking in those, they get access to some free football. And we're looking at how we develop that further with perhaps some podcasts to really start reaching out to our young people. Our YMCA detached youth workers been coming out on patrol with our children and young persons officers, so we can start providing a more holistic interaction with our young people, both at schools and in the wider community. And we've just started some exciting work with the Essex Boys and Girls Clubs. Essex Fire worked with us really closely and across the summer. We've been doing a lot of engagement around some of those ASB hotspots around Roe Hedge, Abberton and Dedham, where the dangers of cold water can be discussed with our young people. And we've been getting out to some of our village fates at West Bergholt, Wormingford, the Northern Gateway Open Day and St Anne's Fun Day, making sure we're engaged and attending with across all the members of our communities. And the final event to mention last week, the successful Rice and Spice Festival, which saw record attendance at the back of First Sight and a chance to engage with a real wide range of our communities. So that hopefully gives you a flavour of some of the work we've been doing since the last meeting. And I'll invite questions whenever you're ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Chair. We're ready to take questions, and if necessary, I can call in members of the partnership who are here virtually.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Rob, for that in-depth analysis of where we are in terms of crime, especially, Rob, thank you for those experiences and explanations. I do want to say to councillors, look at that list of participants. Those are the partners that Pam is talking about in the Safer Colchester Partnership. If you do want to ask questions, then they are here. Thank you all for coming, and Pam will be able to signpost to them with any questions that you have relating to their organisations. I have quite a few questions to kick off with, and I'll look for indications as and when I finish. So quite a few of mine are to Rob, if that's okay. First of all, looking through the report, it talks about the experience of COVID, working with the town marshals, working with the BID, working with our partners within the One Colchester Partnership. I just wondered what lessons were learned from that, being on the ground in different ways, and what we could take forward from that. Secondly, really positive to hear about the progress with county lines. Texting the users, for example, I think that is a really positive step. I wondered what further steps, where do we go from here? Is it still that you are maintaining, keeping a cap on those county lines? Are there further steps that you can take? And as you said, the texting seemed like a really good progressive move. Then the stop and searches as well, that sounded like a progressive move as well. I think you said 8%, and then it was very like the population of ethnic minority and Black, and then you were stopping. So that again sounded progressive. And I just wondered was there anything that you felt, any further steps with anti-racism that you needed within the force, or if you were happily moving towards a point where you could be confident? And then you also talked about, we talked about domestic abuse, and I wanted to come back to sexual abuse around children and schools, bearing in mind my profession. But again, the gender-based hate crime, that sounded progressive and really positive. Could you just unpack that slightly, Rob? What does that mean? Is that they're giving a specific officer? How are we doing it? It sounded like it's something I wanted to hear more about. And again, domestic abuse, we knew during COVID that the concerns about that, we discussed that within the One Colchester Partnership at the time. And the work with repeat offenders, again, sounds really good. And the DA today, again, fantastic if you can make that work. What can we do as partners to help you make that happen? And I was thinking again about young people. What is the experience for a young person seeing domestic abuse? We do know from experience that they are likely to then go on with desensitized behaviors to do something similar. And that takes me into sexual abuse. It definitely is, due to reports we see from Ofsted and beyond in our schools, quite worrying. Sitting next to Tina as well as a teacher, we have training for child sexual abuse, but actually there's more child upon child incidences, and I wondered where you felt we needed to go with that. I will stop shortly. I had a question about the rural strategy, bearing in mind where I come from, Wivenhoe, what your plans are there. In the report, it talked about the probation service. Have you seen any effect yet with that coming back in a national service? And lastly, I'll leave another point about mental health that others might pick up. How can we help expand on that youth engagement that you finished with? Because that sounded excellent as well. And that, I think, is where us as community champions can go. We think we've got an organisation that can work together with you in our communities. So again, who will be best to take that up with to help you deliver a successful policy? Hopefully it's not too much. Most of it was constructive. Thank you, Rob, and I'll collect other indications to speak.
Mark, thank you. Hopefully I've got most of that noted down and can address those for you. So to start with, around the partnership COVID working, I think we were very fortunate in Colchester with our town centre team and the partnership we'd already established with the bid and through One Colchester, that we were probably in a better position than most in that the partnerships were established and we were used to working together. So it was very easy to come together and have those discussions around safety, both from the private sector, for example, Lion Walk and Culver Square, through to our statutory partners. It just further cemented the close working relationship we've already got, and we've seen that continue into the nighttime economy. I've already mentioned the RMPs, the licensing teams, the SOS bus. All of those partners came together during COVID. We were there pre-COVID, we came together during COVID, and we moved on and are still together. One of the key areas that we developed was becoming far more involved in some of the health-based meetings, and I now have a standing invite to the 2-week North East Health Tactical meeting, which is really, really useful to discuss some of the issues that our emergency department suffers. So the lessons learned really were, based on what we knew before. One Colchester's a really strong partnership and everyone's got our backs. And being able to flex One Colchester during COVID to the benefit of the community was great. And the wider Colchester community have been fantastic. When I look at sort of the level of populations and the number of tickets we gave out, really low number of tickets, and most of the engagements we had were very, very positive for our community. But we're continuing those partnerships, the regular town centre meetings, the SAG, planning events, and the combined licensing teams, who are making sure we're still on track with our nighttime economy and that wider piece. So really positive from that point of view. Hopefully that answers your question on that one. Your next one, county lines and further. The text messaging and the need to identify and safeguard vulnerable individuals came about really early in our tactical discussions. We know that county lines need a base, so they set up in a house, and to do that, they exploit somebody and take over their house. So we've done a lot of work with Colchester Borough Homes and some of the other providers around ensuring that their teams can recognise exploitation really early on. And a particularly memorable presentation we did here around exploitation that even involved some of the people that go in and service the boilers, etc. So making sure that we've got as many eyes on the ground as possible to spot that exploitation early. But our violence and vulnerability unit are plugged into a number of NGOs that have a lot of experience extracting gang members from gangs and providing young people those diversions and support. And we're very plugged into health across Essex around actually how do we take a health lead on this around those people with addictions and vulnerabilities, and this is a sort of public health issue rather than necessarily a law enforcement. So we've got a seat at that table with public health to inform those kind of strategies. So there's some really exciting work going on at the centre around that, and we're really lucky with the people on that team who are undertaking some really in-depth academia through Cambridge University as well, to bring that academic learning and that evidence-based policing into that public health environment as well, and join it all up. So there's lots of exciting stuff happening around that. Where did we go next? Let's talk about the DA piece. Yeah, DA and that link to young people, and that ties back into the county lines. Some years ago, there were some studies around those young people who carried knives that showed something like 80% of them involved in knife carrying and violence came from a background of domestic abuse. So that's something that's been built upon, and key is that engagement in schools, working with the education officers provided by the PFCC's office in partnership, Essex Police and Essex County Fire and Rescue, around those safer relationships and what a safe relationship looks like. And we're engaging now at primary, secondary school level and at college and university level to make sure we broaden that as much as we can. In terms of the exploitation, we are plugged into our Crime and Public Protection Command through our tasking processes, and they are monitoring the rise in child sexual exploitation. You're totally right, Mark. A lot of this is young peer-to-peer exploitation. Social media and the access to the internet has seen many people sharing photographs with each other that perhaps they shouldn't share, and with not such free access wouldn't have shared previously. That access to pornography, that we're reliant on parental controls on devices that our children all know how to use far better than we do to try and block that access. So our online team are very plugged into that. We have a dedicated team looking at that. Some really good work going on with schools as well to make sure we get that messaging out about, you know, respect for your own body and the dangers of sharing those kind of images on the internet. But equally, we need to look at how we support the people involved in that. You know, a 13-year-old boy and girl sending images to each other that one then shares. Actually, do we want to criminalise those people, or do we want to support them and help them? So a number of strands of work going on around that piece, Mark. I think I've missed one out, haven't I, around anti-social behaviour?
I asked about the rural strategy.
All right, so
might have been that.
So rural strategy, as we have before, we're expanding our community policing team slightly just to backfill a couple of vacancies, and each of our areas will get a dedicated police officer. Again, we're working really closely with our rural engagement team to look at some of those wider issues around hair coursing, fly tipping, and unlawful encampments, and some really positive work going on there. And what we've learned from the rural engagement team is running that as a central resource across the county really works well. And I know they spend a lot of time up in Colchester. Our marine unit's got, I want to say, some new gadgets, but we were very kindly donated a new smaller craft So we've seen increased waterway patrols as well around some of the antisocial behaviour that we see on the waterways. But key is really developing those relationships with the rural communities, especially those rural businesses, the farming community, for example, getting in early, looking at how we can target, harden and work together to make sure we prevent crime occurring in the first place. Hopefully that answers the question on that one.
Thank you. You've answered pretty much all of my questions. My last one was a constructive point about how we could help expand your youth engagement.
So, absolutely, and I'm really keen that we get into as many organisations as possible. So if you're working with any youth organisations and you think a visit from the police and opening that dialogue would be useful, then please don't hesitate to drop us a line through our community policing team email. You know, one of the examples, the Outhouse, we've just started some work with their youth group as they've reinvigorated themselves after COVID, and we've had some really, really positive sessions there, which has opened us up to a whole new set of young people, and we're really keen to push the messaging around the really active police cadet unit we've got here, the fire break schemes, and get young people involved in a lot of the community-based stuff we're doing.
Thank you, Rob. That's a good point to end and for us as councillors to dwell upon. Pam, you indicated, then I go to other councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add very briefly to Rob's comments. First of all, on rural crime. So I wanted to make sure that those of you, and I know there are some who have engagement with the parish and town councils, are aware of the rural crime toolkit. And we've taken the opportunity at the parish council forum to make sure that communities themselves feel enabled and empowered to play a role in keeping their communities safe. And that very much complements what Rob was saying. And secondly, with regard to youth work, again, everyone in this room and some virtually will know that we were fortunate enough to secure £18.3 million through the Town Deal Fund. A proportion of that has been allocated to the improvement of youth facilities. I'm fortunate enough to sponsor that particular theme of work, and I can absolutely guarantee that the engagement of the Community Safety Partnership, and in particular our police colleagues, will be critical to shaping how we make the very best use of that money, and not forgetting the really important theme of youth mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I have Councillor Nigel Chapman and then Councillor Lorcan Whitehead, and I'll look out for any other indications. Thank you. Nigel, please.
Thank you, Chairman. That's very good. I'm really concentrating, I guess, on the Chief Inspector, really. I mean, that's excellent. And I understand a lot about what's going on, and that's very helpful, I think. As you can probably appreciate, this side of the table, we tend to be pretty rural. So without wishing to belittle a lot of the other bigger stuff, which is very much urban centric, if you like. I spent many years of my early life in the town centre. I always like to refer to the fact that in the 50s and 60s, nobody would have wanted to be in the town centre when the national service regiments used to kick off. So that was a good experience for me. So I do know what the town centre can be like. So I'm not trying to belittle any of what happens, but there are some points I just want to raise about the rural policing, if I may. I think a lot of it is down to perception and communication, probably. There is a perception that we are in the rural areas a bit of a backwater. I think there are often complaints that the police don't attend when things happen in the rural areas, or attend far too late. I think there are also similar sort of issues around speed checks. I think they just feel the police should be out there doing some more speed checks for them. Perhaps you can just sort of, and reassurances, I was going to say reassurance would be helpful on that for me, but I think that's the communication bit. I do think these communities need reassurance, and we used to have regular police attendance at parish council meetings. Well, I understand probably why that was discontinued, but I do think if you do attend a parish council meeting, it does disseminate down through the community. Then anything that's told to the parish councillors does go much further afield. And if they don't get that message, then equally the message that the police are not communicating with us, not working with us, is the one that goes through. So that's something that is just worth, if you can take that on board, maybe. One or two specific things. We did have this aim in Essex Police, I think it's been for several years, frankly, of having a special constable or special policeman in each village. That was an aim, I understand. And I have seen that referred to again recently. And I'm just wondering how that's coming on, because that could be part of that, that communication and perception issue, I think, if that was working well. Pam referred to the rural toolkit. Again, I'm not entirely sure that's got as far as it should through the rural community, so I don't know how we can improve that, but that would be worth looking at. Dare I say, I think it may have got stuck with parish clerks and hasn't got any further, and I think that's something we could look at somehow. And it's a very parochial one, this one. I was very interested to hear you say you're working Dedham around the river, and I've been banging on about that for a long while, because not only am I a councillor for Dedham, I'm also chairman of the Dedham Vale AONB partnership. We have grave concerns about the people jumping off the bridge and that sort of thing. And we've always understood that is Suffolk. And again, that's a question about communication. Are you working with Suffolk Constabulary on that? Or how's that police? There are issues about so many people now go under that bridge on the water. And with youngsters jumping off the bridge, it's tremendously dangerous. And I've seen a hair's breadth between somebody jumping off the bridge, nearly landing on somebody on a board underneath. And if you are there, that's great, but we weren't aware of that, I don't think. And are you working with Suffolk on that, or is it something that Essex patrols? I think that really covers my main points at the moment anyway. Thanks, Chairman.
Councillor, thank you. Okay, so let me cover your main points. A big frustration for me is perception and communication. I'm doing more engagement, more perception, more communication than I've ever done before. We use a number of channels, including parish councils. So your parish councils all get our regular monthly newsletter to share amongst your residents. In June last year, my resident survey told me 48% of people felt informed about what Essex Police were doing in Colchester. As of June 21, 34% of people feel informed, yet I've done about 300 times more engagement than I did the previous year. So any ideas for sharing what we're doing are most welcome. Very key are the parish councils. So we have two dedicated, basically comms officers, if you like, community safety engagement officers, who are forever thumping out messages about what we're doing. They do it across social media, they do it through newsletters, which go to GP surgeries, that go via the Head Teachers Association to every parent of every secondary school in the district and primary school in the district. Our PCSOs are forever taking pictures of themselves and sending those in, and they go out on our social media channels too. So it's really difficult. A conversation I had in Tiptree High Street a little while back with a resident there who was being interviewed by a lady from Radio 4 who blatantly stated we never see police officers in the village, and had just walked past two of my PCSOs 5 minutes before he was stopped and interviewed. And when I pointed that out to him, he said, "Oh, I didn't realise they were police." So it's a continuous battle for us to be visible, and we can be in a village and walking around and it's raining and everybody's indoors and nobody looks out the window and sees us. So we do try and publicise when we're out. We use our neighbourhood watch networks to make sure we're disseminating out crime in your area on a regular basis, so that every household that's subscribed to Neighbourhood Watch is getting a communication that says, basically, there's no crime in your area last week or the week before, or there was this particular shed burglary or this particular bike theft, have some crime prevention advice. In regards to speed checks, we are working really, really hard around some of those. We do know that in some of our rural areas, vehicles are causing antisocial behaviour, especially sort of Abberton Reservoir and that way. So not only have we run a number of high visibility operations in the area, where I then get loads of complaints from local residents who get speeding tickets, but we've actually done some work with our Road Crimes Partnership, and we've had Abberton Reservoir made what's called a TrueCam site. So we can now set a TrueCam up on a tripod and leave it for 3 or 4 hours and catch every single car that comes past. Whereas previously with the handheld devices, we were reliant on stopping the vehicle and taking up some time. But we're continuing to engage, and it's around community volunteers. So it's around getting that community speed watch back up and running, and making sure they're effective and the volunteers feel supported. It's about us getting neighbourhood watch up and running in our areas, making sure the coordinators and volunteers feel supported. And we have a really strong neighbourhood watch network across Colchester District. It's about working with our partners across the rural crime and setting up some of those other watches such as Farm Watch, and we've got a lot of work going on around that. Around specials in villages, Mr. Hurst is pushing our specials agenda again around community specials. It's a really brilliant idea. It would be great to have a special in every village as a local bobby. What we have to look at is some of the reality of policing, in that special needs to carry a Section 5 firearm, which is parva spray. That can only be stored in a safe at a police station. So, for example, if you have a special in West Mersey, when they book on duty, they have to drive to Colchester Police Station, put their kit on, get their radio and drive back to West Mersey. At the end of their shift, they have to drive back, lock it up again and come back again. And that special only needs to volunteer 2 hours a week. That whole 2 hours could be spent driving backwards and forwards just to get kit on. What I would far rather see is that we increase our overall cadre of special constables. And I think at the last count, I have 54 active volunteers on my books of special constables whom I meet with on a regular basis. And they run operations both across our rural and our town centres. What that in effect means is that I can have a greater visibility across wider rural areas than if we just had one constable for one village, if that makes sense. So we're continuing to push that specials recruitment message, and we welcome, as you're talking to people who are passionate about their community and want to be involved, make sure you're mentioning the volunteering options around becoming a special constable, around becoming a community speed watch volunteer, around becoming a neighbourhood watch volunteer. It's really, really important that we bring our communities in and we do this together. But as I say, anything you can give us to increase our visibility and the messaging that we're putting out to our residents is welcome. And in terms of Dedham specifically, the cold water stuff is led by Essex County Fire Rescue. That's their piece. We joined with them because it was a really good opportunity to engage with our young people around antisocial behaviour as well, and spread that message. We might have crossed the border into Suffolk on a couple of occasions to talk to groups and young people, but don't tell Suffolk. We do have regular meetings cross-border with Suffolk, but not to kind of the more minute level of detail that we could do. So one for us to take forward.
Can I just come back? Couple of things. The TrueCam problem, I saw something recently, and I'm not sure I can remember it properly, but saying I thought they weren't going to be, you've obviously got one that you can operate, but they're not being operated more widely in Colchester Division, I believe I heard. Perhaps you could just expand on that, please. Another quick thing was going back to Dedham. Perhaps somebody could have a word. Do I need to contact the fire service, do you think? I'd just like to know what's been going on down there. It'd be very helpful to know what is happening, please.
I will get you an update.
Thank you.
From my
I can then report back, because there is lots of concern about what happens down there. If it has been looked at, then that's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. I will get some colleagues to give you an update, and hopefully you can spread the message about some of the work we've done down there. In terms of TrueCam, there are a number of health and safety requirements around the deployment of TrueCam that didn't necessarily apply to previous speed cameras based on how we need to position it. So in order to deploy a TrueCam, a specialist certified person has to come out and certify the geography as to where it can be deployed. in order to meet health and safety requirements. It is where we are, hence why it's taken us a little while to get this particular site, Abberton Reservoir, detailed for it.
Thank you, Rob. Pam, you indicated.
Yes, thank you. I'm just conscious that we're fortunate enough to have Quinton Sage with us this evening, who's an officer, Essex County Fire and Rescue Service, and he's probably going to hate me for putting him on the spot, but he might either be able to offer some insight now for the benefit of the whole committee or take an action to do so later. Thank you.
Good evening. Unfortunately, the water safety is outside of my remit, although I am aware of what goes on. I'm quite happy to contact our community safety team and get an update for yourselves and for the councillor concerned, and pass that information on if you'd like me to take that away.
Okay, thank you, Quentin, and thank you, Pam, for that. So we've got a few actions there. Councillor Chapman, that'll be coming back to you. Thank you. I've got Lorcan Whitehead next and then Barbara Wood after that. So Lorcan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the partnership members in attendance and for the report. And I mean, before asking questions, I mean, there's three things, like positive things, I think I'd like to kind of say well done. I mean, around the stop and search, I know we had a conversation around that at previous meeting. It's really great to see that those numbers are still in line with the general population of the main population of Colchester. So I think that's very impressive that that's being maintained. The engagement with the kids around the gangs and knife crime, I think, I mean, that I think I'm right in saying that you know, custodial sentences for those sorts of things have been going up in the recent decade, and longer sentences as well. And there's also been calls for longer sentences. And it's good to see a different kind of approach which addresses some of the underlying issues rather than you know, just a kind of blunt instrument of punishment. And something else mentioned in the report is the suicide awareness training, and I did some of that myself, and I can say it's really excellent, some of that training. And I'd recommend other councillors to do it, and members of the public. I mean, there's you know, some fantastic training there. I have several questions. My first one is maybe not for the members of the partnership so much as maybe for our officers. I just noticed at the start of the report, we have this standard equality, diversity and human rights implications point, and it says that there are none. And that just seems slightly strange to me, because you know, given the discrepancies of the impact of crime on certain communities, you know, the higher rates of stop and search, thankfully not here, but elsewhere. I think BAME people are 13% of the population, but 26% of the prison population. Black men, 26% more likely to be remanded in custody than white men. You know, BAME people more likely to be victims of crime. It just seems slightly strange because and also, you know, hate crime is a key priority for the partnership. So it would seem like there's, you know, this report is probably full of implications for that kind of area. My second question is around antisocial behaviour, and two aspects of it, I suppose. So we use PSPOs, and the town centre PSPO stretches into my ward, Newtown and Christchurch. I guess I'd like to know, knowing the good work that the partnership does, how we're capitalising on that partnership approach to ensure that PSPOs are part of a more holistic approach to resolve the underlying problems that, you know, drive that antisocial behaviour, rather than a kind of blunt instrument, which I know, you know, there are people, you know, residents in our borough who quite concerned when it came in. You know, there's been quite a lot of controversy, so maybe we can speak to that a little bit. And the second aspect of antisocial behaviour, maybe on the other side of the coin, is how can we address some of the more persistent problems of noise and abuse? Because, I mean, I can speak in terms of an experience in my ward, and sometimes they seem to be kind of unresolvable. So we've lost a local neighbourhood watch coordinator recently, partly because they were a victim of really persistent problems of noise and abuse. And it seems like the processes weren't capable of resolving that. And, you know, I spoke to Graham Steele, our district coordinator for Neighbourhood Watch, and, you know, he said, you know, he feels that at times the process seems to be almost weighted in favour of the perpetrator rather than the victim. And I'm sure this is a very complicated thing to actually, you know, a thorny problem to resolve. But is there, you know, more that maybe the partnership can do to try to resolve those sorts of really difficult cases? My third question is maybe to kind of allow an opportunity maybe to expand a little bit more on something that Pam said in response to a previous question around, so there have been plans for the youth zone, and so I'm interested to know what we think the impact of the youth zone might be on providing opportunities for young people, and what maybe the opportunity cost would be of not pursuing that kind of initiative. And you know, really, yeah, I think that's probably that one. And my fourth question, I only have 5, so I won't keep you much longer. My fourth question is, we have the proposed cut to universal credit coming up. That's you know, going to be a very significant thing for the people it's going to affect. It's going to have a huge impact on lots of people, and that may well spill over into other problems for the wider community. So I'm just wondering if there's been any assessment of the likely impact of that, if we have a sense of kind of what we might expect to be the fallout from that, if there are any plans around mitigation measures or things that we could be thinking about in that area. And finally, a question about 2 new pieces of legislation that I've mentioned briefly in the report. So first is the Domestic Abuse Act, which has brought in some new requirements. I'm just wondering, because I don't know, what are the new requirements that have been brought in there, and how are these being met? And the other one is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which is a proposed piece of legislation, which is, you know, set to potentially bring in some new requirements around the way that public process is policed, amongst other things. It strikes me from my understanding of it that it would be quite a difficult piece of legislation potentially for the police to actually implement. It's potentially kind of vague and open to interpretation and might pose some problems around that. But it also poses some potential risks around civil liberties. So I'm just wondering if that is to come in, are there any reassurances you could give around how civil liberties would be protected? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. I think we'll go between Pam and Rob with those. The question number 1, I'm sure Pam will deal with, but I think that's a problem partly in how we write our reports, and it's more about a decision that is being taken and the impact of the decision, whereas we're not really taking a decision tonight, and that's probably why it's written in that way. But I absolutely understand your question, and we did actually have some good progressive points made by the inspector earlier, but I'll leave Pam to try and answer that in a more rounded way. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I thought to have a go at trying to work out who the best person is to respond to some of those. Is that okay? I'd like to start, if I may, because I can't resist the temptation. It's such an important subject. To comment on your thoughts, Councillor Whitehead, about suicide. This is a big preoccupation of mine and my colleagues at the moment. And the reason for that is that Colchester and Tendring do have the 2nd and 3rd highest suicide rates in the whole country. And that's not something that we can just let go. So first of all, a bit of reassurance on that we're doing a huge amount of work, and I'd like the opportunity to share that with you more widely. And my colleague Richard Clifford behind me is in the process at the moment of organising a member development session. And I know we've done a little bit of this before. I know some of you have done the training around suicide prevention. However, I think there's more to say, there's more to offer. So please, councillors, watch a diary date around that, because I think you are in a fantastic position in your surgeries, through your contact with local residents, to spot the signs. They're very difficult to spot, but you're in a great position together with GPs who are also doing this training to spot the signs so that we can signpost people to avoid taking the very worst and most drastic option. So thank you for your comments on that. With equality and diversity, I think Councillor Corey's made a good point. It's about the decision. However, I think you've touched on something really, really important here. And I think we're guilty in writing the report of taking this for granted because of what you said, that everything in here is about addressing gender, for example, equality around race. There's a whole range of, it's so inbuilt that I don't think we've taken credit for it. So I will absolutely guarantee we'll put that right next year and summarise the equality and diversity implications. I thought with the question on the PSPO, I'd start with that and then maybe I can hand over to you, Rob, and then we'll come back to noise abuse if we may, Mark. But with ASBs, I should take some responsibility for the PSPOs because I sign them off. And I sign them off once I'm assured that there is strong evidence to justify a measure like this, which does restrict people's freedoms to some extent, but there's a good cause for that. As far as a holistic approach is concerned, and I will turn to Rob in a moment, I can absolutely guarantee that if an area is regarded as warranting a PSPO, Public Safety Protection Order, then it's certainly warranted a great deal of other attention, not just from the Borough Council, but from the whole range of partners that we have here today. I'll pick out my colleagues in Colchester Borough Homes in particular. You can be absolutely sure that they will have an interest in this, and that colleagues such as Lisa Hobson, Sonia Carr are coordinating that holistic approach so that residents and visitors to those areas feel supported. So I'll hand over to Rob to make some comments on that, and then perhaps we can come back to abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, key, I think Luscombe's a really good example of that kind of holistic approach where we have people who are street homeless, who have alcohol issues, who are begging, and we give them supportive options before prosecution and that ability to access all the services in a one-stop shop. And the partners have all come together really well around that. And that's the key, it's right that we provide support options. It's right that we provide diversion options and alternatives. And we discuss on a regular basis amongst the partnerships, problem areas, problem individuals, and look at that wider piece of work that we can do. And around all the antisocial behaviour we deal with, we've invoked the community triggers under the ASB Act on 2 or 3 occasions recently, because it's a really good way to get that kind of peer-to-peer review across what we're doing and ensure that we're involving all the agencies and looking at all the options to provide the best possible service for both perpetrators and the victims of that behaviour. So hopefully that answers your question around that one.
So if I can come back for a moment then to answer the point about the abuse, particularly in relation to the Neighbourhood Watch coordinator who's had to resign. And I'm really glad that you've given me the opportunity to recognise the fantastic work that Graham Stell, I'm not quite sure if I pronounced it that correctly, but he'll know who I mean, because he is just such a stalwart as far as this work is concerned. Always there, always professional, always able to support the work of communities. In terms of supporting victims, the council and our wider Colchester partnership, One Colchester, has recently adopted a set of principles known as Communities Can, and that's very much about enabling communities to step up and take their role in keeping Colchester safe, for example. Therefore, people that do come forward, like coordinators, absolutely have to have our support. If that abuse is reported, it's a police matter. So before I go on in answering any more of your questions, I'll just hand over to Rob to describe what sort of support is available for community champions like this.
So, we will look at a specific set of issues. As I've said, we'll work with our partners to address those. Where it falls into criminal offences, it'll be subject to an investigation. Where it falls into a non-crime offence and antisocial behaviour will be subject to risk assessment and investigation and an outcome. Obviously, I can't comment on a specific case because I don't know the details of that, but more than happy for you to make contact with me and we can have that review. As I say, from my point of view, when we're dealing with what sounds like a persistent abuse, we would need to be involving all our partners and seeing how we can address that and what we can do.
Thank you. So, you got your microphone? No. Sorry, there's a bit of feedback there. So I'll have a go at answering the point about the youth zone. I'll also try and respond to the universal credit, but perhaps I could just give a bit of pre-notification to partners on the call. With the Domestic Abuse Act, we have the opportunity today, and I thank her for her attendance, to have Beverly Jones, who's the Chief Executive of Next Chapter, and she and my colleague Mel Rundle might want to talk about what the implications of the Domestic Abuse Act. The courts bill, I'm afraid I'm not qualified to comment. Are you either? Are you able to comment?
I'm not going to pass any comment on the police and courts bill. Right. It hasn't been completely ratified yet, and it would be wrong for me to speculate.
Okay, so we'll start with the youth zone, and for those who aren't aware of where we are with the youth zone at the moment, just an update that the Town Deal Board, which met quite recently to make some decisions about priorities, was not at this particular time able to make a commitment to the youth zone for a variety of reasons. One being uncertainty around the revenue funding, and secondly, an appropriate site that met the requirements of the decision makers on side. However, I think it's fair to say the opportunities for a youth zone continue to be explored. However, that doesn't mean we're not doing anything about youth facilities. And you'll know, just mentioned it slightly earlier, that we're working very well, I've got to say. We're really pleased with the partnership working with Essex County Council and colleagues in youth services there to see what can be done in the absence of a youth zone to either improve the facilities that we've already got, and you won't be surprised that in that mix is the townhouse just around the corner, and also to align with the Essex County Council strategy to make sure youth services or assets in communities themselves where young people live are supported. So you can expect to see further scrutiny, which I think is going to take place in February of next year, more detail around how those millions of pounds are going into youth facilities, and I'd say again, the point around mental health. And finally, my point before I hand over to Bev, if she's prepared to take this question, is universal credit. You must have been reading our minds, because only yesterday, senior management team at Colchester Borough Council, joined by Pam Green, the Chief Operating Officer at the CCG, had a very good conversation about winter pressures. Now, winter pressures usually means waiting lists, delays in elective surgery, but this year it's much more than that. It's about the reduction in universal credit, it's about the end of furlough, it's about an increase in food prices, it's about challenges around utilities. There's a whole range of stuff that is going to face our most vulnerable communities. And we are putting together, as we speak, not just a Colchester Borough Council plan, but a partnership plan to make sure that we are reducing the impacts of those challenges, and of course the potential of another round of COVID, infections around flu. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it? We're not in for the easiest of winters, but you can be absolutely assured that this partnership is working together to reduce the impacts and make sure inequalities don't widen further. And the final point about domestic abuse, again, I'm sorry just to land this with you, Beverly, but I do know that you'll be looking at this closely. Chair, are you happy to bring in Beverly Jones?
Absolutely, thank you, Pam. Beverly Jones, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Pam, for bringing me in. As you might expect, I've got a little sort of ready reckoner document that I've managed to pull up in a couple of minutes' notice that you gave me, which I can just run through in terms of the key elements of the Domestic Abuse Act as they affect. Sorry, my husband's just come in the kitchen. You can hear a noise. So in terms of the Domestic Abuse Act, I guess importantly, what it does is introduce a statutory definition for domestic abuse that includes wider ranging legal definition of domestic abuse, incorporating things like emotional, coercive or controlling behaviour and economic abuse. I think very importantly, for us, it also recognises children and young people as victims in their own right. This has been something that we've been campaigning for a number of years, because clearly children who experience domestic abuse in their family setting are victims in their own right. They may well be in a different room, but they absolutely are affected by domestic abuse that they hear and the sense that they feel in the home, and that impacts them for potentially the rest of their lives if they aren't supported as victims of domestic abuse. Also, alongside that, earlier in the year, there was a lowering of the minimum age for domestic abuse by a partner, which means that the age for domestic abuse by a partner is lowered to 16. What this means is that all of the effects of the Domestic Abuse Act and everything that brings in are actually affecting young people. So from anybody from 16 and above are protected by the new measures that have come in as part of the Act. It establishes in law the Office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner to stand up for victims and survivors, raise public awareness, and a whole range of activity. I'm sure that Chief Inspector Huddleston will know more about this, but it creates a domestic abuse protection notice and domestic abuse protection order, which replaces the domestic violence protection notices and orders. And the idea around them is that they offer longer term flexible protection for victims by imposing conditions on perpetrators that they have to comply with. The idea is that they'll be piloted in a number of areas before they're rolled out nationally. It also, I don't know if you've heard of Clare's Law, which is Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme. That places guidance underpinning that and puts it on a statutory footing for people who need to or want to find out information about a new partner or a potential partner. It creates a new offence around non-fatal strangulation and provides clarification that consent to serious harm for sexual gratification is not a defence in law. That's the sort of clamp down on the rough sex gone wrong defence in cases. It also provides special measures for in civil, criminal and family courts for vulnerable witnesses, including victims of domestic abuse, to enable them to be able to give their best evidence without being intimidated within the court setting. And alongside that, prohibits the cross-examination of that person for particular circumstances in family and civil proceedings. I think probably the most impact in terms of local authorities are that it introduces a statutory duty on Tier 1 local authorities to support victims and their children in safe accommodation. And the definition of safe accommodation has been extended not just beyond the classic refuge, which we have too, but into other forms of safe accommodation, so sanctuary scheme, dispersed housing, move-on housing, secondary housing. So it really widens, and temporary housing as well, which has a big impact because for the first time they've put in a set of standards. So the MHCLG or the Women's Aid standards are applied to that housing. So it's very, very specific about the type of support that needs to be provided alongside that safe accommodation. What it also does is it rules out bed and breakfast and other accommodation that's similar to bed and breakfast. It says that that is inappropriate for safe accommodation for victims who are put into temporary accommodation as a result of being homeless because of domestic abuse. So I think given our knowledge around the supply of housing stock, that creates quite a tension, which I'm sure that councillors will hear about at some point. It also places a duty on Tier 2 authorities to cooperate with Tier 1 authorities around all that I've just talked about. And lastly, what it does is extend the protection for housing tenure to victims who are fleeing domestic abuse. So if they had a lifelong tenancy when they fled, then there is a need to maintain that for them. They're also given a priority in their own right if they present as homeless as a result of domestic abuse. I think that's it. That's a whistle-stop tour of the Domestic Abuse Act, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Beverly. That's very helpful. Gave us a lot more depth and sort of information about how that links with the work that the Chief Inspector explained earlier. Pam, I'll come back to you. And I just wanted to say that the conversation on universal credit, I think many of us support, and thank you for raising that point, Councillor Whitehead. And also we've got the leader of the council at the back of the room, which I appreciate his attendance, because those conversations you're having, Pam, with other partners on the call, and the conversations you recently had will be something that will happen around the cabinet table as well, and how we as a council can ensure we support those vulnerable people and identify them proactively, as we have done in the past with benefit changes. Back to you, Pam.
Well, I just hope you're happy to bring in my colleague Mel Rundle, because she's indicated that she'd like to add something to my answer to Councillor Whitehead on PSPOs, if you're happy for that to happen.
Thank you, Pam. Yes, over to you, Mel.
Thank you, councillors. Good evening, everyone. It was just to provide some reassurance to Councillor Whitehead in terms of all aspects of antisocial behaviour. So whether it be the public space protection orders or some of the awful experiences you were mentioning in relation to noise and difficulties perhaps with neighbours. We have so many different mechanisms for picking this up as a partnership. So you'll probably remember that we have the town centre action plan and the fortnightly meetings with all partners to look at things such as PSPOs and those causing harm and distress in our localities in the town centre and in rural areas. And in terms of specific cases, if people are experiencing horrendous noise or issues with neighbours and things, obviously we have our environmental protection team who would pick those issues up. And of course, as Chief Inspector Huddleston has already said, we will of course convene either a community trigger meeting or essentially a multi-agency partnership meeting where we look at problem solving and finding solutions. And as Pam has already mentioned, you know, that's not always us finding the solutions. Sometimes it's looking at the community's can approach to enable residents to find the solutions for themselves, but with some support and advice on hand from us. So that was it really. I just wanted to provide that reassurance.
Thank you, Mel. That's really helpful. Pam, I'll come back to you. Are there any further points to make in response to Councillor Whitehead's questions?
I think the gap is around the courts bill, which I think we feel unable to comment on at this point. I hope you understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. A quick response?
Yeah, just to say, I do understand that, and thank you very much for the answers, and thank you for the offering for me to contact you about the other case. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Barbara Wood next, and then Councillor Tina Bourne after that. So over to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Right, my question actually refers to the agenda. And can I first of all thank you for updating it, because that answered 3 of my questions. But anyway, I have one question left, and it's on page 28. And it refers to the Nights of Action. And it's to do with the Essex Police and Partners. And it says that it reads Nights of Action, etc., etc. And it says you've had a couple of meetings so far. You've had one on the 16th, 17th of April, another one on the 21st and 22nd of May. I mean, are there any forthcoming events on that agenda? Thank you.
Please may I come back? Well, I need to bring Mel back in actually, because Mel's responsible with her team for organising Nights of Action, which obviously require the full support of the police and other partners, including our colleagues in health, particularly around some of the mental health issues that emerge when we do a Night of Action. Mel, are you able to answer that?
Yes, Pam, I can come back in. I think there may have been a further Night of Action that hasn't been put on the annual partnership plan, but I will check that. And absolutely, interestingly, we were having a discussion only yesterday in the office about some of the issues that Rob described that we've been experiencing recently in the town centre since the restrictions have lifted and people are going back out to enjoy themselves. So it's not something we tend to publicise, because obviously, as we all know, if people know we're coming, they tend to behave very differently to how they would behave if they didn't know we were coming. So it's certainly something we will be looking at in the next few weeks, as you know, things like payday at the end of the month and things, and we'll be looking at engaging with people who have I think they're called drugs dogs, to do some more activity. But it's probably something you will hear about after it's happened, rather than giving you notification it's happening, because we do try to keep it a bit on the down low, for want of a better word. But absolutely, it's something we're constantly reviewing and responding when the need arises, but it's always on our agenda, as well as days of action as well, if there are issues in the daytime economy.
Thank you, Mel. Barbara, back to you.
No, thank you for that response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to Councillor Tina Bourne, please.
Thank you, Chair. I do want to say thank you very much. It seems rather trite, really, to sit in the meeting and say thank you very much, because it underestimates the work that is done by all these partners. And over the years, having experienced the relationships that have been built over a period of time, it is clear to me that you have the right people in the partnership who really are bothered about the impact of crime in our communities, bothered about the individual impact and the holistic impact, and wanting to do something about it. I remember us as a council pulling together various things, decades ago, around what the council could do, but now having the expertise of all these various partnership groups in the area has really strengthened our resolve to not just lament the cause of crime, but actually to do something about it. I reflect on the vulnerable people within our communities who are particularly impacted by crime. They're likely to suffer more crime than other non-vulnerable people, and that individual instance of crime or cumulative effect increases their vulnerability more. And that's why we should, particularly in the last couple of years, with a greater focus on health and well-being, that we have to resource this. So I've just got really just a couple of questions. One about resourcing. Is it possible to maintain this level of resourcing going forward? These are statutory partnerships. These are agencies that are already impacted by various reductions in budgets over time, which then has an impact on succession planning. These are people that I see here on the screen and in your partnership who have, with the best will in the world, they have an enormous amount of expertise. What is coming on behind those people? Because the relationships you've managed to build up really do drive forward these actions. Without that relationship, you have nothing. It's not just about goodwill, it's about, as I said before, people being bothered on the strategic level and an operational level, and having the authority to pull the levers and put in some really concrete, practical, almost rule breaking, dare I say it, in some instances, that actually this is not our bag, but we're going to make it our bag because we want to make the lives of these people better. And that's when a partnership works better. There's terms of reference, there's memorandums of understanding, but this is real things that are happening to real people, and they're impacting their everyday lives. I would really like to ask my colleagues in the North Quadrant Children and Families Service, basically because I like them very much, and two, they haven't spoken tonight, on the Essex Youth Offending Service, the Lived Experiences project, because that's something that seems to have been developed over a period of time. And 2 years is a long time to run a project. Again, it takes resourcing, it feeds into the idea of, succession planning. What are we going to learn from that? And I'm particularly interested by the gate opening and gate closing moments. And I wondered if I could hear a bit more about that. It says in the plan on page 47 about that 4 workshops have been designed, and I wondered who was going to be receiving the information from those workshops, because it looks like a bit more than lessons learned. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bourne. Pam, who are we turning to this time?
Well, I'll make a start, if I may, on the resourcing issue and the succession planning. But I see that, as always, Lee Bailey has come to represent Essex County Council and Children's and Families Services. Lee is a fantastic advocate for the work, and he is consistently there to support Colchester. So an opportunity to thank him, but at the same time getting to answer some of your questions, Councillor Bourne. So with regards to resourcing, the Community Safety Partnership itself relies entirely for its resources on a grant from the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, for which we're very grateful, and other grants that the team apply for. And if that's all there was to it, we'd achieve absolutely nothing or not very much. But of course, we don't. We call upon the resources and goodwill of all of these partners. And so when you take the collective contribution, it becomes really worth having and really valuable. If ever we lose that goodwill, because only a small amount of it is statutory. I mean, we've got a number of non-statutory partners with us tonight. A good example would be Community 360. We've got Tracy Rudling, the Chief Executive, with us. So we rely entirely on goodwill and the resources of other partners to supplement the very small budget that the partnership has. The second point about succession planning, I think my own view is that all leaders have the responsibility to make sure there's someone to follow behind. And you're absolutely right that this partnership is successful because of the relationships, but they're not just strategic. So if I take 360 as an example, Tracy and I find ourselves at a lot of meetings that are about strategy, but we also have a team that includes Mel and my colleague Michelle Tarbin and Lucy Bredman, one of our assistant directors, and a range of others across the partnership who operate at a tactical and operational level. And Rob mentioned earlier the tactical cell meeting, the famous tactical cell meeting, which takes place every Tuesday, coordinated by our colleagues in health. But we all get a chance at an operational level to work out how these strategic intentions get translated, the challenges along the way, the obstacles, how do we get around them? So others might want to come in and they can indicate to the chair, but I would have thought I can be quite clear about that. I can reassure you that at every level we have strong distributed leadership, whether it's team leaders, operational managers or strategic leaders. The third point around children's services, Lee, you've had about a minute to think about this. Is it possible, Chair, I could hand over to Lee Bailey? Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. So first and foremost, a caveat that I'm by no means an expert in youth offending services by any means, and unfortunately, the ability to do this subject justice is not my own. But I will try my best, Councillor Bourne, and try and get through it with you. What I will say is that there is quite a substantive report that's been undertaken about the Lived Experiences project, of which my colleagues in the youth service, I'm sure, would be happy for you to have a look at and possibly have a conversation with you a bit further about the progress made around that. But in essence, as you said, it's been running for 2 years with the aim of trying to capture the life experiences of 10 young people in Colchester who have either been in the youth justice system or have actually currently going through that. And the idea being was we wanted to learn lessons and sort of walk in their shoes, really, in terms of understanding the issues, the problems, the key sort of moments in their lives that either changed or helped them move forward with their lives. So that program's been running for 2 years. We wanted to make sure that we weren't doing it just solely with those young people, but we were doing it with the families as a whole to understand their experiences around being involved with a young person in the youth offending services and what that meant for them as families and their siblings, but also about how we sort of worked with professionals around the anxieties around some of the issues that they were also seeing in terms of working with those young people. So we've completed that stage. And as it alludes to in the report, we've completed 4 workshops, of which we're then going to start categorizing them into, you know, relationships, the bigger picture, and missed opportunities for us as a service and us as partnerships in working with these young people to get the best out of them. As I say, a brief narrative into the programme, Councillor Bourne, and apologies on my behalf, but I'm sure colleagues from the Youth Offending Service will be happy to have a conversation and send the report through for further information if that's required. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Councillor Bourne, further questions?
Thank you very much. Yes, Lee, I would really like to see that report. That's great, and I think it would certainly deserve wider reading if that is possible. It can be circulated to all councillors, because these are things I know all councillors have been probably involved at some time or another with reporting or concerned about county lines work around their particular patch and the heightened impact on young people and the robbing of their life chances should young people get into that, and the exploitation that goes with that, and the language that goes around that as well. And I think it'd probably be a good idea to share some of the language. I'm not sure as councillors that we are using the correct language and terminology around child exploitation, around domestic abuse, and around all of those hidden harms that we could do. And I think that would give us a better understanding for if we are reporting or if we have concerns, because we are also the eyes and ears of the community as well. I just really want to maximise our impact as a group of 51 councillors. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tina. Are there any further comments from Rob or Pam on those points? Pam?
Yes, I just wanted to pick up the point about language and response that Councillor Bourne has made. I've been putting quite a lot of demands on Richard Clifford recently to organise yet another member briefing, but I just think there's so much to say. There's so much to tell you about some of these new or rapidly changing problems. So I do hope we could, once we've received this report, Lee, look to do a member briefing. And perhaps you could give me the right contacts so that all members, all 51 councillors, are fully informed about the opportunities to have an impact in this area and to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. That links me back to a comment I wanted to make, and an issue I really want to bring up, is to do with the Safer Advisory Group work that the county are pursuing. Work that I touched on earlier about sexual abuse within schools, but in particular the links there between domestic violence, culture of violence towards women, and however low level up to the sharpest end, the most troubling end of it. And I'm proud that I will be inputting into that Safer Advisory Group at county, but I want to make sure that at every level we're carrying out that work. And I know that from what Rob mentioned earlier about gender hate crime, I know with our proactive partners that we have here, we can tackle it in some form. It is a cultural problem. From a young age onwards, we saw it with the football. We praised in emotion, work around celebrating the football team and that kind of stuff. But at the time, I mentioned the increase in domestic violence that we see. So I just wanted to make that point, and I know, Pam, you'd be supportive of that, but I want to see us as Colchester engaging in that, trying to tackle that, trying to have the discussion to work out what it is within our culture and our society that brings about that sort of toxic masculinity that can really harm men and women. But there's a lot more to go on about that at another time. Pam, is there anything you wanted to respond on that?
Just to confirm that we've formally accepted the invitation to participate in that work only last week. So we'll be doing so fully with support of Mel's team and the work of the wider partnership as a whole. I think it's very likely that we will be bringing a briefing to One Colchester on this. And as you know, Councillor Corey, we get very good attendance at a series of webinars we do, making sure that we are fully informed as partners of the range of issues that impact on community safety, health and wellbeing, economic prosperity, etc. So full engagement. I hope I can speak for all partners in saying the same.
Thank you, Pam. That's really promising, and it's always understood that you would put in the best efforts in your officers. And I want to ensure that our members as well do the same. We have got Beverly Oxford here this evening, and I appreciate that she as portfolio holder has been here on the call. And I might come to you, Bev, just to ask if you can input into that work, but also anything else that you wanted to explain this evening in terms of priorities as a cabinet member on these particular subjects. For example, engagement in our communities. I said earlier to Rob, how could we help expand on those? I'd be happy to come with you to you in a minute to ask about that. But just before I do, I just want to say that thank you for all of the partners that are on this call this evening, some of whom I've worked with in the past, and know that those contributions, you talk about the tactical cell, that deals with such relevant issues amongst really key partners. We talk about the wider work that happens at One Colchester Partnership. I know from the position I have within the Health Alliance, the work we do. I know Tracy Rudling is here this evening and perhaps hasn't been able to speak on some of the most relevant questions tonight, but I know the work she does with Community 360 supports our community in such a wide and diverse way that means we can tackle these issues at source, or we can tackle the causes of those issues. So thank you all for those partners who have attended on the call this evening. Beverly Oxford, I wondered if I could come to you just to note the points I'd made and bring in anything that's relevant from your point of view, please.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody. I always think that engagement is one of the most important things we can do, because if you don't engage with people, how do you know what is going on? And I think the wider public can give us so much insights on things that perhaps we would miss because we're not in it, we're not there, we're not feeling it at the time, and they can give us the insights that we need to progress priorities and policies, because they are their experience in it. It's quite easy to, in some cases, basically write a report and say how we would like to do this and how we would like to do that. But unless you've engaged with the people that are going to be affected by these policies and these ideas and these remedies and things like that, unless you've actually engaged them and said, have we got this right? Are we doing this how we should? Then you can write as many reports as you like, but you won't necessarily have the effects you want, because the very people you want to help and support and help change their lives, you've not engaged with them to begin with. I think sometimes we can get a little bit sidetracked with our positions and how we are and what we think we should be doing and how we think we should be doing it. But the people on the ground that are feeling it, experiencing the antisocial behaviour, experiencing crime, they're the ones that we need to take with us. They're the ones we need to listen to. And I'm so grateful that the police and everybody and the partnerships are working together now, have actually realised how important it is for everybody to work together, to share and to make things better for the very people that we are trying to help. It's such a nice change that people are willing now to share things and talk about things and say, this is how we did it, how did you do it? How did that work for you? Rather than saying, well, this is the way I've done it, this is how it should be done, and this is the way I'm going to continue to do it, which might not necessarily be the right thing. So I think we're really moving forward in partnership, working, listening and talking to each other and helping each other, because by doing that, we can help our residents and the general public and bring them along with us. I think that's about it, unless you have anything else. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I wondered just on youth engagement if there is anything, but if not, Bev, we can come back to that. It's just I offered to Rob Huddleston, really, if we can help as a council on youth engagement as much as possible.
Whatever help I can give to whoever, I am always willing to go there, to meet people, to talk to people. If they think I can be of assistance, then yes, certainly. I don't mind helping anybody out who needs it. I don't mind talking to anybody who needs it. And if I don't know something, I will always take that away and find out and come back, because I don't know everything. It's also helpful for me to learn things.
Okay, thank you, Bev. Are there any other comments from councillors this evening? Otherwise, I think we've engaged. Councillor Willits, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I guess on these occasions, the police tend to bear the brunt of the questioning, but the action is actually to review the Safer Colchester partnership, which we should be scrutinising over the period March to September of this year. Now, I suppose many of us we understand perhaps the role of the police and their objectives much more clearly than we do many of the other agencies. So, if I could start off just by bowling 3 questions arising from the police report. And then I'll come back to a further question, which really follows on from what Beverly was stating. How do we ensure that we maximise the effectiveness seen by residents as opposed to by the councillors who think they know what should be provided? But my questions in regard to the police presentation were, firstly, on the matter of the crimes reported. It was good to see that we have 86, or only 86 per 100,000, whereas the residents of Harlow are experiencing 115 per 100,000 residents. But there was no mention of what the best statistic is for the boroughs and districts, and it's always useful to know just where we should be aiming. And on that point, I've always felt that one of the most important statistics is the rate of convictions, because the number of reports of crime is certainly an interesting issue. That gives us a sort of feel for the number of crimes that are occurring. But in terms of the effectiveness, I have this passion to know what is the conviction rate at the end of it. And I know that that is a serial process, because the police are just apprehending offenders, and then one has the various other steps in the way, including the magistrates or the courts, before we actually get to convictions. But I would have thought that that was one of the more useful statistics which the public wish to know, and wonder whether there is any information or enlightenment on that particular point. The second question is on the rather difficult issue of stop and searches, because if stop and search are carried out purely on the basis of intelligence and with absolutely no reference to ethnics or any other issue, but it turns out that one particular ethnic group still comes out as having more or a higher proportion of the stop and searches than the average. How are we going to deal with that? Is there going to be a tendency to say, well, perhaps we should ease off on stop and searches on that particular ethnic group? Or would we continue to say, we will impartially stop and search purely on intelligence, completely blind to the colour, creed, or so on of the potential offenders that are being stopped? And my third question was, I was quite frankly surprised to hear your remarks about the difficulty of having to keep all the dangerous equipment in the centre of Colchester, so that a special from Mersey would have to come all the way up to Colchester to collect their kit. I thought that the Crime Commissioner was aiming to have multi-purpose centres. For instance, fire stations could be used as locations from which the police could operate. And surely there must be other sort of home office type of premises closer to Mersey than Colchester Police Station, which are relatively secure and would meet the home office requirements for storage of dangerous equipment. If I can stop at that point before I come back to the other matter of the wider scrutiny of the Safer Colchester Partnership.
Thank you, Dennis. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, so I'm just waiting for something to load so I can give you some more detailed figures around solve rates, etc. So I'll start with the difficulty of equipment. Yes, the Police Fire Crime Commissioner is talking to a number of partners about use of their buildings. And that is an aspiration for the future that we will get agreement. I am not sure of the status of those negotiations or where we are in them. And at the moment, the only approved premises for a CS or Parva spray is a police station. So that then starts to look at all sorts of legislation changes potentially around firearms law. So is a slightly more strategic level than I am, but it's one of the big challenges that the PFCC is seeking to overcome. In terms of statistics, where is the best currently in terms of crime per population is Rochford at 48.8 crimes per head of population. And if I look at the figures we're basing that on, Colchester of a population of 194,000 and Rochford a population of 87,000. So they have 3 times less people than we do, but only half the crime rate. So I think that kind of puts us in a fairly comparable position on that one. In terms of solve rate, you talked specifically about a conviction rate. We don't necessarily talk about a conviction rate because that is dependent on a number of factors around the court system. What we are looking for is a positive outcome for our victims of crime, because we are now looking at some of those options around restorative justice and that kind of outcome to aid recovery. And as is typical, I'm waiting for this to load while I talk. So we are sitting off the top of my head in Colchester at around somewhere like 19% solve rate. But once this comes up, I'll be able to confirm it for you.
If I could continue with my second, I think it's a single question rather than a set of questions, Chairman, while the data is loading. As part of our review of these services, perhaps I've always wanted to be a bean counter because I like to ask the question, what are the alternatives to the way we are doing things at the moment? We have developed a relationship with a series of other organisations which has fairly sparse matrix management about it, and it's it mirrors what happens in commerce, where you have many organizations or divisions which all play a small part in the sum of the whole, providing their expertise or their resources. So in the Safer Colchester Partnership, I think we can probably account for what goes into it in terms of time and effort and the very wide range of specialist advice that goes in. But in common with the problem of matrix management in business, it is far more difficult to measure just what is coming out of it. And if it's not possible to measure the effectiveness of the output of the product, it always leaves open the question that Beverly Oxford was just posing. Are we operating a system which is most effective of the resources used? And also, I was much heartened by Beverly's question, as seen by the residents as opposed to seen by the councillors. So I wonder whether it is possible to indicate from the position of coordinating the Safer Colchester Partnership, Chairman, how we actually measure the output and how you convince yourself that this is the best way of doing things, because I think that question really is at the heart of the scrutiny of how the strategic partnership works, particularly when the partnership is in a state of flux and we're moving from a relatively self-contained Safer Colchester Partnership to a wider partnership based on one Colchester, if indeed one Colchester is about one Colchester and doesn't forget about the rural areas. If we are having those migrations, there needs to be a view, and we need to scrutinise that view. Are things getting more effective, more efficient? Are they getting better for the residents? Or are we just taking an alternative approach because we've drifted into it? And when one reads many of the items which are placed for our review this evening, it is difficult to understand just what the effectiveness is. And I'm just opening the page, enlightenment, partnership with schools across the district, working together to identify vulnerable students, etc. But it never tells us how many vulnerable students have been identified and what the targets were and whether those targets were actually met. The next issue, Box Smart, very useful, and sort of when one scratches the surface, it's just the sort of thing that should be done. Weekly boxing sessions for 12 vulnerable 12 to 16-year-olds who might be vulnerable to the danger of county lines. Well, just how do we measure whether they were vulnerable? How do we measure our success in preventing them being badly influenced by county lines? So looking all the way through this, I have this worry that we know what the input is, but we only have a very vague feel for what the output is. And most of the time, we're just hoping with fingers crossed that what we're doing is the right thing, and that if we give boxing to these children, they will, or young adults, they will be pulled away from the influence of county lines. But do we know it? Have we measured it? Are there success stories? Is it possible ever to measure it? Is it possible to measure the success, or do we just have to take a best guess on these matters? And if that is so, how do we at the end of the day scrutinise and say, yes, having looked at this, it is the best way to do it? And perhaps the alternatives of, rather than having a very sparse matrix, of perhaps bringing together the specialists as one team rather than just borrowing small amounts of time. I don't know how we make a judgment and how we scrutinise the alternatives and whether what we're doing at the moment is the best way, Chairman. So those are the great unknowns that I have when we come to scrutinise this arrangement. We have lots of people who are doing some absolutely magnificent work, and we've heard many of them this evening, but is it the best way of actually running a safer Colchester partnership? And is it the way that gets the maximum advantage from the minimum amount of resource at a time when resource is under pressure? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Willits. And Rob, good luck trying to answer some of that. I think that I know some of the answers in a sense. Over to you.
So you've raised so many interesting points there. I wish we had more time, Councillor Willits. And if I fail to answer your question as well as you might like, I'm more than happy to have a conversation outside this meeting. So, is there a better way? Is it the optimum way of delivering both our statutory responsibilities, which we do through the Safer Colchester Partnership, and our wider moral, ethical responsibilities to Colchester through One Colchester, is a moot point. However, what I'd like to reassure you about is that we constantly stay open to the opportunity to do things differently and better and to learn from others, which is why we have the current arrangements. So up until a couple of years ago, the Community Safety Partnership stood alone as a group of statutory partners with a couple of voluntary sector partners joining us. However, for me, it seemed to undermine the opportunities to link, as I said earlier, community safety with economic prosperity and health and well-being. It seems to me that you're going to have a much less safe society if individuals don't have a secure tenancy, if they don't have good health, and very importantly, if they don't have a job. So we chose to sit our statutory responsibilities in that wider context. And we've only been doing this for a couple of years, but we constantly stay open to, is there a better way? Could we join forces, for example, with our colleagues in tendering so that we have a northeast perspective? So I want to assure you that we're not complacent. Your point about matrix working is probably the most difficult, as you know, one of the most difficult types of working, because you're almost entirely reliant, and Councillor Bourne mentioned this when she talked about relationships, you're entirely reliant, almost entirely reliant on goodwill, the cooperation, shared vision, and that's what I think we have for Colchester. So there is possibly a better way. However, I think we all have the same objectives across this partnership, which for a safer, healthier, and more prosperous Colchester. That's all very nice to say, isn't it? Good words, but what does that mean for the residents that live here? So you're right, there are very few quantitative measures of success here. And if we did have a few more resources, we could employ an evaluation resource, a bean counter, as you put it, to really focus on the numbers, but we don't. So we choose to focus our resources where there is evidence that this will help us achieve our objectives. So you picked out a couple of examples there, and you asked some questions about whether they're working and what impact they have. I can absolutely guarantee that every single one of these outcomes detailed in Appendix A is based on evidence. It may not be quantitative evidence, but it will certainly be strong qualitative evidence. And my last point, before I hand over to anyone else who wants to say anything about how we run the partnership, other than from me, is that what we try to do is to make sure that every resident feels safe in their communities, in their home. And of course we fail, because we know that not everyone does. But what this partnership does is to make sure that collectively, when we become aware, and we do, whether it's a PSPO issue or whether it's a local neighbourhood dispute, where we become aware of the fact that a resident or a family or a group, an ethnic group, for example, doesn't feel safe in their community, we marshal all the resources that you can see in front of you to make sure we can remedy or respond to that, so that the individual in question or the family in question has some reassurance that the quality of their life will improve. And where we fail to do that, then we are open to scrutiny, both the police, the council, all of our partners. I feel I probably haven't answered your point fully, but I would just conclude before handing over to Rob and others that we stay wide open to the opportunities to do things differently that might improve the outcomes for residents. May I bring Chief Inspector Huddleston in?
Thank you. Councillor, exactly as Pam has said, and the operations you've mentioned about us identifying vulnerable young people who are at risk, that's done through a complicated algorithm and outcomes of a lot of learning from a lot of very experienced professionals in the field of children and young people, and our violence and vulnerability unit. And if we can get into young people really early, even if it's one that we can get down to a boxing club and teach them some self-confidence, some self-respect, that anti-bullying message, actually it might just give them the confidence to say no to the person trying to bring them into that gang, which actually economically, 12 weeks in a boxing club at £5 a week kind of idea is better than the years of misery caused by them becoming a high-risk missing person, exploited by a gang, the abuse they will suffer and the risk to themselves, but equally that then risk to the wider community as they go on to perpetrate other violence. So that's kind of why we embed into that. We do that as a multi-agency. We work with children's services really, really closely, and we work with the schools. And you know, those outcomes are measured through a number of different metrics. And you know, when we work with schools, for example, primarily we're looking at how do we reduce the number of kids that are going to get excluded. So you've got a matrix there that says 6 years ago how many children were being excluded, now how many are being excluded. So is the work that the multi-agency partnerships are doing around education, is that justified? So we do have those metrics, but they don't just all sit in this one report, if that makes sense. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour too. There is some quantitative analysis as well as qualitative. And if I can go back to your previous question to give you some reassurance. So the solved rate as it stands for Colchester is 16.2%. The solved rate for the wider force is 13.8. And I just want to reassure you around that. It seems exceptionally low, but what you have to remember is the sheer volume of crime we get reported on a daily basis. And if I talk in figures, for 2021 for Colchester, so far 16,979 crimes, many of which are my car got scratched down it last night, parked in a country lane, my shed got broken into, and there are no investigative opportunities. I can't give you the figures for how many are investigative opportunity, no investigative opportunity, and the ratios around that, but just to give you a flavour of some of the outcomes. And the question I didn't address with you was your question around stop search being intelligence-led. So we, rest assured, we drilled down very, very deeply, and I gave you the figure for percentage of black or black British people stopped at 8%. So we hold records via Home Office classifications to be able to drill down into white and mixed and white backgrounds, mixed race backgrounds, Chinese or other ethnicity backgrounds, black British or Asian and Asian British, and we keep statistics around the stop search for all of those. What's really, really key is ensuring that we don't reach a situation where a young black man is more than sort of 8 or 9 times more likely to be stopped than a white man, for example. How does that work? If that's intelligence, saying that particular person is carrying a weapon, we need to analyse very carefully that intelligence. And perhaps after the 3rd or 4th time of stopping that person, say, well, the intelligence is fundamentally flawed because we've stopped them 3 or 4 times and we haven't found anything. So we have, as part of our diversity, equality and inclusion strategy, which is a force-wide strategy, part of that is opening ourselves up to that independent scrutiny. Through our independent advisory group, I report on a monthly basis, which Tracy chairs, to key individuals from our diverse community on our stop search and our hate crime figures. Within the force, we've got a scrutiny panel whereby we analyse those figures down to looking at individual stop searches. And as I mentioned earlier, watching that body-worn video of that particular interaction. We also look at the percentage of positive outcomes on those stop searches. So we're making sure that where we're doing it, we are ethical with what we're doing. The second point from that, moving on, is looking at our intelligence sources. And is there a bias in that intelligence source that's coming in? So again, that's a piece of work led by our Serious Crime Directorate and our intelligence community around how do we quality assure the intelligence coming in. And the way we do that is to provenance that intelligence. We look at the sources of our intelligence and we grade them for reliability based on a number of key factors. So to give you that reassurance, we're taking every step we can to ensure that we are totally ethical with what we do, that we are totally transparent with what we do. And we're constantly looking to develop, I work with Tracy really closely, we're constantly looking to develop that independent advisory group. And I've just asked Pam, who's kindly given me somebody to help with the data, to bring up to date what's our understanding of the diverse mix of Colchester today. You know, in the last weeks, we've had Afghan families resettled here, so we've already gone out and made contact with them and started to look at how we integrate those families into the community, working with our settled Afghan community leaders, but also some of our wider community. And it's key to make sure we continuously monitor that IAG to make sure we've got the right people on there. The people representing their communities are representing the voice of their community, do have that key network within their community to feed back into the community. So we can go back to what Pam was saying, so that those individual families in the community who perhaps don't have the confidence to come forward and speak directly to us have a conduit into the community safety partnership so we can address their issues. I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you, Jem. The only point on which I didn't quite hear an answer was the matter of the migration of the Safer Colchester Partnership into the One Colchester Partnership. Might I ask, Chairman, whether there was a business case, whether there is a dialogue, an explanation of precisely what is happening, why it's happening, and what the benefits are going to be. I would have thought that that is a sort of significant epoch for Safer Colchester Partnership, which should surely have been scrutinised by us as part of the Crime and Disorder Committee, perhaps before it happened. Is there any additional material? Is that a decision which is open to scrutiny? Thank you.
Please.
Well, yes, of course, it is open to scrutiny, but I just want to assure you about the decision-making process and the statutory role of the partnership, which remains. And as you know, Councillor Willits, a number of responsibilities come with that. For example, our response to a domestic homicide review, which every statutory community safety partnership across the country, and we've had a bit more than our fair share, have to take responsibility for. Nothing has changed about that. And the accountability up to the Home Office through this panel remains exactly the same. However, the view was of some partners and some individuals within the partnership, and of me as chair, was that we were failing to make the right linkages. So I really want to reassure you that the Community Safety Partnership as a statutory body remains completely secure and independent. However, once a quarter, and that's it, once a quarter, we report the work not only of this partnership, but the delivery group, which includes tens and tens of partners, to the wider One Colchester group, which, as you know, is entirely non-statutory, entirely voluntary. And that was intended to do one thing, which is to make the link between people feeling safe in their communities, their well-being, and the economic prosperity and opportunities that they face. So in a way, well, not in a way, it is an entirely informal process intended to deliver our system-wide responsibilities. And as you know, and colleagues will know generally, we achieve many now of our Colchester Borough Council objectives within the system. A good example would be the paper that came to Cabinet a couple of weeks ago, which talked about the investment that colleagues from the CCG have made into Colchester Borough Council. so that we can deliver our health and well-being objectives through investment in the system. And this is just another example, but to conclude, the links with the One Colchester partnership remain entirely informal. The links between the partnership and this committee remain entirely formal and open to scrutiny. Whether I should have brought this to a previous meeting of this committee is a good point. I can assure you that there was a lot of consultation, and my colleague on the call, Tracy Rudling, and in fact, I know we had the support of Councillor Bourne at the time, revised the terms of reference of One Colchester to allow that oversight. At no time did we go anywhere near the terms of reference of the partnership itself. But I've been more than happy to go through some of the papers and share those with you more widely. I think they're about 2.5 years old now, from what I can recall.
Thank you, Pam. That's a really helpful answer. From my experience of seeing the before and after, it's a much better fit in terms of you have not changed, as you've explained, the statutory role of the Safer Colchester Partnership. Instead, you've built around it a much better safety net, which at the beginning of the meeting, Rob explained the worth of that during COVID, as did you. So I think that actually we've seen a lot of the qualitative and quantitative benefits of working in this way. So I only see it as a positive, I can guarantee from what I have seen. And that comes with the different hats that I work with and the number of people on the call this evening who would, I'm sure, prolong this meeting for another 2 hours if I asked all of them to speak about the benefits of working in this way. But as you've answered, Councillor Willits, quite clearly, the Safer Colchester Partnership remains the statutory body. Around that is this team of partners working together, which creates a much better way of working, and it has definitely given Colchester benefits so far. If we want to scrutinise that further, we could take that to another meeting, but I think Pam is happy, Councillor Willits, to take offline with you as well if needs be.
Yes, I'm sure that could go, but what we have to recall, Chairman, is that this is a scrutiny panel and that you as Chairman may well understand some of these issues because of previous roles or other things that you do, but it is still important that the panel as such is able to scrutinise these sort of serious decisions. And there is a high degree of interrelationship here. And we started off earlier on in this meeting addressing the question of the youth zone and the importance of youth work in making Colchester a safer place, making the youth safe, making Colchester safe. Now, that runs into the town deal, which was the funding body. The town deal is closely associated with One Colchester. So there is a high degree of interlinkage with all of this activity. And we need, as the scrutiny body, to be able to understand what those linkages are, whether those linkages are being best served, or whether they should be strengthened or perhaps weakened in some cases. And I see that as an essential part of the role of scrutinising the Safer Colchester Partnership. So it is not just looking at specific issues that councillors want to happen and drive forward certain ideals, but it's taking a wider look at the way the whole unit is operating and convincing ourselves that it is operating in the best possible way, the most effective way to provide the outcomes which we have all discussed and I think we all buy into, and that should be an integral part of our work programme.
Thank you, Pam. Finally, please.
So finally, I'd like to make an offer to the Scrutiny Committee as a whole, not the Crime and Disorder Committee, although I know you're the same people, but we could very easily put in front of you that wider look. We could bring One Colchester to your Scrutiny Committee to make sure that you have that insight into the wider system working, because you're absolutely right. We are very interdependent. We can't achieve our strategic objectives unless we've got all these people behind us. However, what I could also do in the context of that briefing is to give you more assurance that the sovereignty, accountability and responsibility of the CSP, which you have responsibility for scrutinising, is safe, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Pam. That is helpful. We'll note that Owen has noted it, and we'll see how we can fit that in. Also, a councillor briefing, as we often ask from scrutiny, may be helpful on 1 Colchester. Okay, I think we've exhausted all avenues tonight, and I appreciate, I was hoping to finish at 8, but we've run over. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to call the meeting to an end. That is the main item on the agenda, and we have no part B. So I want to thank all the partners virtually attending. Thank you. And thank you to Pam and thank you to Rob this evening. Continue the great work you're doing. Thank you for answering our questions and for any future briefings that Pam you can give us on the wider partnership. Thank you. Thank you all. Good night.